It's okay to want an abortion. Did you know 1 in 4 people who can get pregnant will have one? So it's actually more common than most people think. At CareFM, you can choose what type of abortion care works best for you. We have in-person locations with private entrances in Atlanta, Chicago, and the Washington, D.C. areas. And we also offer medically supported abortion pills by mail in 20 states. For some people, it's more comforting to come into a private office where they can sit with one of our medical providers and either leave no longer pregnant or with abortion pills in hand. For others, they prefer to get abortion pills through the mail so they can decide the best time and place to complete the process. Getting abortion pills by mail from CareFM is simple. Fill out an online form, and a licensed provider will review your medical history. And if eligible, your medication will be shipped to you in a couple of days. Kara, our text-based abortion companion, will guide you through the process from start to finish with instructions, reminders, and answers to all your questions whenever they come up 24/7. With either choice, please know CareFM will support you every step of the way. Learn more at carefm.org.
In Walmart's Who Newville, joy started to grow. For online-only savings sure to steal the show. Tech treats and toys so dazzling and new. Walmart Cyber Monday deal soon ready for you. It's online only with very little time to spare. December 1st will soon be here, so be sure to be there. The Who's are prepared. Are you ready too? A day packed with savings. Amazing! Who knew? Subject to availability, terms and fees apply.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. You're ready to move your business forward, but first, you need to find the right team. Start your search with Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It can help you reach qualified candidates fast, ensuring your listing is the first one they see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs are 90% more likely to report a hire than non-sponsored jobs. See the results for yourself. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Nelson and Trubridge were midshipmen together out in the East Indies. They grew up under the supervision of a very talented master on board called Thomas Surridge, who eventually would make Rear Admiral. That was a brilliant surveyor. And so they grow up with an acute appreciation of the importance of hydrography.
Hello. In 1795, the Admiralty established the Royal Navy's Hydrography Office, which became the world leader in charting the waters of the globe as ships of the line sailed the oceans, pursuing their traditional enemy, the French. Treacherous waters were navigated with a skill that is quite breathtaking and laid the groundwork, along with Trafalgar, for a century of domination of the waves. Joining today is historian and Royal Navy veteran Michael Barritt, himself a hydrographer and author of Nelson's Pathfinders, as he explains the growth of the discipline and how it was used to help the great admirals of the Navy, including Collingwood and, of course, Nelson. Coming up, we go back to the Wars of the Three Kingdoms with Prince Rupert of the Rhine, and then some medieval history with Henry III. Our film club is the Thin Red Line, so please do share with friends and family. And until then, it's me talking Nelson's Pathfinders with Michael Barritt. Michael, thanks so much for joining again on the podcast. Great pleasure to have you on. Thank you.
Good to be back.
And so last time you very kindly talked us through the Battle of Trafalgar on the anniversary. And so I'll put a link in for the listeners there to listen back if they're interested. But really, I wanted to speak to you today because of your book, Nelson's Pathfinders, is so interesting to read about, and then of course to get you on to talk about, because this is, I was reading through it before we started speaking, and it's really a kind of the skill level of the seamen, sailors who were serving during this era is, I mean, I'm rather in awe of them. And then of course one reads about the author, i.e. you, had a similar role but in a more modern navy as well. I mean, really, I suppose these are your forebears.
They are indeed, yes, and that's really what took me down this track. When we were conducting surveys, we were often given copies of the older surveys, the people who've gone before us. So, for example, out in the southwest approaches, we'd be given surveys made by men operating in tiny paddle steamers. When they got caught in storms, they anchored out there, and just observing the phenomenal results they achieved in ways that are difficult for us to conceive now when we walk around with mobile smartphones with sat nav on it. Even when I was out there, we didn't have sat nav. Except in the most advanced ships. So really admiring what they achieved with the technology of their day. Whilst I was out there, I started writing about them, and when I got more time more recently, settled down to produce this account. And really, I'm only just scratching the surface there of the extraordinary story.
Well, so these are the book is titled Nelson's Pathfinders, which I suppose Pathfinders being a word to help associate readers, but their official title, well, they were part of the is it the Hydrographic Office?
Well, perhaps I could just say a word about the title first. Some people know what the title of their book is going to be from the outset, and some titles, I'm sure you can think of them, are absolutely inspired. Some titles are hard work, and this one was. And I can only claim credit for two parts of it. One is the forgotten story, because I really think it is a forgotten story. The other is Pathfinder, which I think is the right description for the sort of work I was doing. But I got quite a lot of discouragement, particularly from booksellers who said, watch out. Pathfinders nowadays means Royal Air Force, not Royal Navy. It means World War II, and certainly not the Napoleonic Wars. So then Julian Luce, who is an absolutely brilliant commissioning editor, stepped in, and the final title with Nelson in there is his creation, and I'm sure it's helped to sell a lot of books. I was a bit uneasy to begin with. I thought people are going to say, "Oh, not another book about Nelson. Is there anything new to say?" Um, but in the end, I was very comfortable about it because this is something we may want to come on to. Nelson had such an acute appreciation of hydrography. One very kind reviewer, his sole criticism was of the title because I mentioned Nelson and could have mentioned so many others, but Nelson did deserve it.
Yes, yes, we definitely need to get onto that, and you did touch on that when we talked about Trafalgar. But okay, so for the layman or someone like me, how would you describe the sort of skill that you're writing about here during this period of, well, really extended warfare? I mean, your introduction, you write about the 7 Years' War, and one assumes, we're talking about the Royal Navy here that has accumulated a huge amount of skill prior to the start of the Napoleonic Wars. But what exactly is this skill, and how, what stage are we at? At the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars, when the Royal Navy's been around for some time anyway.
Hmm. Yes, thank you. Let me pick up the question that I didn't move on to there in a sense, the level of organization within the Navy for it, which was not there. So the basic skill sets that we're dealing here are ones that would be expected of any navigator at sea. The ability to lay down an accurate position and to find your way into a harbour or anchorage, and indeed to make your way across the open sea and get to that anchorage. All skills required of someone competent to navigate and then command a ship. And within the Navy, that role was allocated to the warrant officer, known as the master. And in most Royal Naval ships, that they were drawn from the merchant service. They probably had ample experience as commanders of ships. And I think an important point to make there is that if one wants an effective military navy, you need to have a background of a healthy maritime economy and society, which we did right through the 18th century. But for the business of hydrographic surveying, you do need higher skills. Certainly, all the masters and indeed the captains were told that we expect you to send information into the Admiralty particularly when you go to a new place. They were required to submit what were called remark books with special headings laying down what they were expected to note to help other people to follow in their footsteps. And if they could accompany that with a plan, however simple, with soundings all to the good. And they were warned if they didn't do that, they wouldn't get paid. But to produce really good information required higher training, and that was not widely available. And one of the fascinating threads that I've followed in this work is the background education of the specialists who later on Thomas Heard would recruit and form into a cadre, and that didn't happen, as you see in the book, until right at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Amongst the officers, there were two ways you could acquire that. One was to go to the Naval Academy in Portsmouth, where they had a very advanced course in mathematics and right through to spherical trigonometry and astronomy. And some of the most prominent figures came through that way. Another source which produced both officers and the masters was Christ Hospital School, the mathematical school that Charles II had set up. But there's another source of really prominent figures in my list of Pathfinders, and that's the Scots, both officers and masters, a signal really of how far advanced education was in Scotland compared to England. Did I mention this last time we met? I can't remember.
I don't think you did, actually.
Well, in England, until I think it took a second Act of Parliament in 1832 to open up the syllabus, certainly in the church schools, to include mathematics and what we'd call science. Up in Scotland, by contrast, arithmetic was taught in all the primary schools, and in bigger towns and in coastal towns, because people were anxious to get on in life and wanted skills. Advanced mathematics was taught. And hence we find again and again masters and officers in my list are Scots.
Fascinating. And so, yeah, so and really, I guess the requirement for this skill is that, and I know this having seen a map of the sheer number of shipwrecks, certainly that surround the British Isles. And so this is why you need people who can navigate their way through. I mean, that's the ultimate reason, is it?
Yes. You put your finger really on a core requirement, and perhaps the skill that was prized most by hydrographic officers when they sent people out into the field, and that was to make astronomic observations, and latterly to employ chronometers, that great breakthrough in a sense, to find longitude. And we know there are there are books out there which have told that story, although they tell it in an imbalanced way, really. It wasn't all Harrison and his clock. There was lots of other important work, building up tables. The astronomy was really important. But eventually, people, and I just mentioned a few names, Peter Heywood, mutineer in the Bounty, very accomplished in astronomy, made a lot of observations throughout the East Indies. William Henry Smith, who features greatly in my book, in the Mediterranean, doing similarly. Those precise positions enabled the hydrographic officers to lay down a framework for the small scale charts, which enabled voyages to be planned, and provided a ship was equipped with chronometers, which was not always the case, then that was a real breakthrough in safe navigation. Then once you get close to shore, there's the matter of sounding thoroughly with a lead line in those days, but being able to lay down the soundings precisely.
And so by sounding, you mean to see how deep the water is?
That's right, to measure the depth of the water. Also, the bottom of the lead was concave. It was filled with tallow, and with that you picked up a sample of the seabed, really important. Could be a real factor in telling people where they were. Fascinating in the western approaches to the English Channel. from medieval times. There were records of how the composition and colour of the bottom changed from the French shore to the British shore. Some of that early observation is still there in the sailing directions today. But to do that work efficiently and produce a good plan in coastal waters, you needed what was called control. You could do that to a degree just by taking compass bearings, a network of compass bearings between points. But to lay it down more efficiently, you would want to measure a baseline, which they do in those days with either with chains made out of stable metal. If they haven't got that, they might soak a lead line carefully and then measure with that. And from either end of that baseline, they begin to observe, just as land surveyors do, a network of triangles using a theodolite. And that's the sort of more advanced skill, which also needs more time, that hydrographers are looking for to improve their charting.
Well, you mentioned Peter Hayward there and the mutineer on the Bounty. And that makes me think this skill that these sailors have acquired and learnt and through their experience and from study as well, doesn't strike me as that you can tell me how many there were, so that if you do lose one to a mutiny, that's not only have you lost a senior sailor, you've also lost someone with a huge amount of knowledge. I mean, how much of a problem was it to lose people like Hayward?
Well, Hayward was fortunate in that he escaped hanging. He was a mutineer and he escaped the noose thanks to his influential friends, and was able to go on and deploy those skills. If I might just mention one of his counterparts, you probably spotted it in the book. I do find that there's a golden spider's web that runs through this story of skills handed down. So I suppose like any other profession, isn't it? And you've got that incredible man, Bligh, handing down skills to others, including these two young men. They were young men. I mean, Hayward was a teenager. It's hardly surprising he went adrift, really, in Tahiti. And the other chap was Thomas Hayward. Rather an isolated figure, unlike Hayward, not regarded as one of the gentry. His father was a doctor, but a very competent young man. He was in with Bligh on that incredible boat journey. When he got back to Britain, they said, right, you're going back out there because you can identify the mutineers. So he went back out with Edward and the Pandora. Pandora was wrecked. Hayward goes through a second boat journey. In the meantime, he's proved his worth. He's been taking astronomical observations, making little charts. So in the East Indies, he finds favour with the Admiral, who puts him in charge of a little sloop, sends him out to do surveys, and he would have made post captain, except that he vanishes in a storm, in a tornado. So yeah, there you lose a man of great promise, and it leaves a gap. Nonetheless, in my listing, which I hope to publish downstream in a more technical book, I've got, I think off the top of my head, somewhere in the order of 350 people rendering charts of various standards.
350 people in a... How many were in the Royal Navy at the time?
Well into the four figures. Sorry, I had that off the head. It's a small, yes.
Yes, that's what I was getting at. Yes,
but nonetheless, given that people have written that the Navy showed absolutely no interest in hydrography at this time, it just simply isn't true.
Yes. And so with the onset of war, does this mean there's a diversion of resources and really we're taking the fight to the French as opposed to really expanding knowledge about the seaways?
Well, I wouldn't have said we were putting a lot of particular effort into expanding the knowledge. We certainly didn't have specialist ships, for example. And really, it was the onset of war in a way which stimulated that. Just an example, the Admiralty commissioned a ship and chose an officer specifically to send out to the East Indies as a surveying ship, but prompted by the outset of war. It really sharpened things up, just as 2 years after the outbreak of war, they finally got round to appointing a hydrographer with a capital H.
Yeah. Now, is this Thomas Hurd?
No, it's his predecessor, Alexander Dalrymple. He's a civilian. He's already the hydrographer to the East India Company, so he's moonlighting at the Admiralty, and he's got a very limited remit. He's got nothing to do with tasking ships for doing the work. His role is to advise the Admiralty on which charts to buy to get round to issuing them to the fleet. We might just note that at the outbreak of the war, the system was still in place whereby the master in the ship was responsible for buying the charts to use on board. There was no issue of them at all.
What, the Royal Navy really left it to your own purse?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, that's probably not changed a huge amount in that, with the Royal Navy not being particularly generous with its budgets.
That was the case, and so Dalrymple's remit was to look at what was available, which was a very variable quality, and to then persuade the Admiral to start investing in an organised supply to the fleet. He began to publish Admiralty charts. They didn't start appearing until just the beginning of the 19th century, and it was Thomas Hurd, his successor, who established the system that is still there today of publication of the Admiralty's own charts. And he also introduced a system for issuing them to the fleet in folios, and they went out, some in boxes, some in buckram folders. That was Thomas Hurd's contribution.
It is fascinating. Now, well, two things strike me. One is that, what are the French doing? Because, after the Royal Navy, the French Navy is probably the next largest. Do they have something comparable?
Yes, they'd in fact had a Dépôt des cartes pleins de la marine since 1720. They, right down to today, have a quite different but characteristic approach to this business. Their hydrographic surveyors emerged from les grandes écoles, highly trained, really highly trained. And that was the same in the 18th century. The hydrographic surveyors emerged from the body of geographers in France, the land surveyors. They produced splendid charts. We couldn't wait to get our hands on them over here.
And was it something that was shared, or was this sort of, these are confidential materials that France does not want to share with her rival?
It's a mixture, really. And I think as hostilities came round, there's certainly a famous incident where a rather notorious naval officer called Lord Camelford went over to France in the Truce of Amiens with the specific purpose of trying to get hold of a lot of French charts. But probably the older ones, the Neptune Francois, for example, was obtainable over here. And it ought to be said that despite all the hostility in the 18th century, there were very close links between the hydrographic officers and a lot of respect for the other side. And in fact, there was an interesting incident in this respect during the war, which involved Dalrymple and led to his removal from office. Both countries had expeditions in hand. That really is the exception to what I said earlier. We weren't doing much data gathering, but we did have expeditions out, mainly around Australia. Matthew Flinders was out there circumnavigating, and at the same time, a French expedition. And a subsequent French expedition went out. Just to keep the story short, a lot of the original charts from the French expedition fell into our hands. They were captured by a British frigate and brought to London, where Dalrymple got them and locked them in a drawer and said, right, this is a sacred deposit, and we must honour the work of another country. We're not going to publish this. They must be allowed to publish it when the time came round. Well, a body of advisory officers, including Thomas Hurd, said, this is nonsense. There's a war on. We want this stuff. But it's just indicative of that respect. But the other aspect, I think, which is interesting in terms of French capability, is that there's a French hydrographic surveyor, highly esteemed. His own particular work and his handbook on hydrography was translated into English. His name was Bertrand Beaupré. Wonderful work in many respects, but interestingly, once war got underway, he was very limited in the areas in which he could work because of our sea control. So his work was largely confined to the River Scheldt.
Oh, so we're blocking all the ports, so the French can't get out.
If he tries to go out and survey, we'll grab him and he'll be a prisoner of war. So in the Scheldt and the upper end of the Adriatic, he was able to do some work, but otherwise, no. French effort was entirely stymied during the war, by contrast to our own.
Fascinating. Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show.
You mentioned that many of the senior figures who had come through Naval College at Portsmouth, and I'm just interested, what's their kind of skill level? Because obviously you have people like Hurd and Dalrymple who are the absolute pinnacle experts in the Royal Navy. But what about some of the better known admirals that we might be familiar with in that era? Collingwood, of course, Nelson. Could you get to that level and think this was all a load of hokum and I'll just go using my senses? I don't need some mathematician telling me how to sail my ship.
You could do, but it's very rare to find anyone saying that. Just briefly picking up the Naval Academy, it needs to be said that that was not a popular route of entry into the Royal Navy. The people who came through there were regarded as Admiralty men who the Admiralty popped into a ship, whereas the captain liked to choose his own protégés. So it wasn't a particularly popular way of going in, and very limited numbers came through that route. But there were some strikingly good examples. Jane Austen's brother Francis is a prominent example of a product. And I mentioned earlier the curriculum they had. So they had unparalleled training behind them. But no, a lot of the senior officers had a very acute sense of the importance of hydrography. You mentioned Collingwood. I don't often hear it mentioned with him, but I was looking at a biography of him recently and was delighted to see in there some examples of little surveys he'd made himself in the Mediterranean earlier in his career. Nelson and Treacherous were midshipmen together out in the East Indies. They grew up under the supervision of a very talented master on board called Thomas Surridge, who eventually would make Rear Admiral. That was a brilliant surveyor. And so they grew up with an acute appreciation of the importance of hydrography. Perhaps I could follow the Treacherous thread, since I think we talked about Nelson last time. Poor old Thomas Treacherous, I feel sorry for him. If people remember him, what do they remember him for? Probably largely for running aground at the Battle of the Nile and not getting into action. That must have been really, I can't overemphasize the chagrin he must have felt, because this was a man who'd bent over backwards throughout his career to gather hydrographic information, not least in the Mediterranean. There are books in the Naval Library, the Admiralty Library, Naval Historical Branch, full of his meticulous gathering of information for the Mediterranean in particular. He gave to Dalrymple dozens of manuscript charts. And we find him finally playing, to my mind, an absolutely key role in the campaign of Trafalgar, leading up to the battle in the Mediterranean theatre, where the Mediterranean fleet was gathering a lot of information, making a lot of plans. In fact, if we look across the whole span of the Napoleonic Wars, more work came in from the Mediterranean than anywhere else. The admiral in charge out there during the truce between the two wars, Richard Bickerton, had been sending a lot in. Nelson did the same. When it arrived in the Admiralty, who was watching out for it? Thomas Treacherous. Straight away handing it to Dalrymple. Dalrymple looking at it, giving it to his engravers and saying, just tidy this up a little bit, and then we'll run off some copies and send them back out to the fleet, always with a covering note from Thomas Trubridge. Here's 20 copies for you. Give these to people who can improve them. Keep this circulation going. Really, a very significant figure.
At Carafem, you can choose the abortion care that works best for you. With in-person visits in Atlanta, Chicago, and the D.C. area, or medically supported abortion pills by mail in 20 states. Some people feel more comfortable meeting with a provider in person and leaving either no longer pregnant or with pills in hand. Others prefer getting abortion pills by mail. Just fill out a short online form, and if eligible, your medication arrives in a few days in a plain package. When you choose abortion pills, Cara, our text-based abortion companion, is with you every step of the way, offering 24/7 support and answers whenever you need them. However you get care, Carafem will support you every step of the way. Learn more at carafem.org.
Where are the most kind of dangerous parts for the fleet to have sailed through, taking into account we're in a wartime situation? One thinks of the Mediterranean and perhaps around. I know Greece itself has seen a huge number of shipwrecks around it. Are there particular areas of the Med where the Royal Navy was fighting the French, but I guess at the same time having to take into account treacherous waters?
Interestingly, I just gave a lecture the other day in France on charting of the Mediterranean, and really, there's one key danger greater than any others in the Mediterranean. Was still a hazard during the Malta convoys in World War II. The Skirky Bank, which lies in the western approaches to the Sicilian Channel that joins the two basins of the sea together. And known since medieval times, there are ancient wrecks on that bank. But it brings us back to that key problem of navigation out of sight of land. If you haven't got the right tools, particularly if you haven't got a chronometer, or if you haven't got a decent small-scale chart to guide you on which dangers like that are laid down precisely. And so in 1804, a frigate was bowling along to carry dispatches and a lot of money. I think it was something in the order of £30,000 worth of specie to pay the British garrison in Sicily. The ship's name was the Athenian. And one of the problems with these charts was that they showed a lot of spurious information out in deep water, so that there were some banks that they go back, supposed banks that they go backwards and forwards over and not find anything, and their trust in the charts dipped. And so this happened with the Skirky Bank, and the court-martial evidence shows that the captain of the Athenian said, well, if this Skirky Bank exists, we should be upon it. Shortly after he was. This ship was a total loss and 347 people died. And the real tragedy revealed by the court-martial was that bank had been surveyed, and that least depth that he ran on had been found a couple of years earlier. Work commissioned by Lord Keith, another of these admirals who really knew the importance of hydrographic information. And number of factors there. The ship didn't have a chronometer. Alexander Dalrymple was scathing. He said, if the Admiralty just paid to put a chronometer in every ship, it would have cost them less than the loss of this ship and 347 lives.
Yes, these ships are hugely expensive.
Yes,
it seems extraordinary.
Yeah. One other extraordinary thing I discovered in the course of my research is I was absolutely stupefied. When Victory deployed at the beginning of the Trafalgar campaign, it was done in an awful rush. In fact, if I remember correctly, in the end, Nelson decided he couldn't wait for Victory to be ready, and he started off in a frigate. So it was all a bit of a rush, but extraordinarily, Victory sailed without a chronometer.
And how much was a chronometer in that era?
Pass. But except to say that there were officers, William Durban, who surveyed the Skirky Bank, had 6 chronometers which he'd purchased personally. That's a massive personal outlay. Popham, Hugh Riggs Popham, surveying the Red Sea. I think if I remember correctly, he had 8. again, which he'd bought. So, I mean, they might be expensive, but in terms of outlay of a government, compared to the overall cost of a ship, insignificant. And poor old Thomas Atkinson, the master and the Victory, there's a wonderful survival in the Maritime Museum. It's a set of French charts which he'd lifted off one of the French prizes at the Nile, which was his set of charts for the Mediterranean. And it's an extremely rare example of the chart used not just as a reference document that you unroll and look at, but he scribed positions on it. But what he scribed on there as he approaches the North African coast, as Nelson goes to see where the Villeneuve's in Alexandria, and on the way back as they come up past Crete, he's just not sure how well the coastline's plotted on this old chart. And he's got no chronometer. So what you see are long lines, which are his observations for latitude. He's somewhere on that line. He'll probably put an estimated position on there. But those lines are giving him just a sort of feel for how far he is off the danger of the African coast or the dangers around Crete. It's a real pointer to the hazards in a sea like the Mediterranean or anywhere if you just haven't got these essential tools, a decent chart, a chronometer, and the appropriate tables.
Yes, you mentioned the captain of the Athenian at his court-martial having lost his ship. I mean, what was the result of the court-martial? I mean, it sounds...
He wasn't one of the survivors. So.
Ah, okay.
The survivors, if I recall, were not people who had been directly involved in the navigation. So, but those were the revelations that came out. The lack of trust in the chart, the lack of a chronometer. But I think it also sharpened up the need to get information out there. The hydrographer had produced a plan of the bank. It was much improved by subsequent work, but it really underlined the need to get information out quickly.
Yes, because I guess you think, I mean, okay, so for me, you would, with having no skill at all, but you would think you're in the open sea, there's no land around, it must be hugely deep, and so there's no problem. And then, of course, it isn't. I was interested reading about your own experience, and I know you briefly mentioned right at the beginning that you recognized a lot of the skills or a lot of the methods used. I mean, what was your involvement in the Royal Navy hydrographer's office more recently?
The very tail end of my career, I was a hydrographer of the Navy. That post had changed quite a bit. We were back to the position right at the beginning. Alexander Dalrymple was a civilian, and we just appointed another civilian, Dr. Wynne Williams, a senior civil servant, to be chief executive of the Hydrographic Office. He became known as the National Hydrographer. I was the hydrographer of the Navy and the head of profession for the information gatherers. And so I went on to the board of the Hydrographic Office as a non-executive director to bring that sort of experience to bear. That was quite important. It meant that I could help to assess the incoming work with an appreciation of what was involved in the gathering of it, but also give advice on its application, certainly in terms of Royal Naval usage, as much as for mariners in general.
And what kit are they using? Because, of course, you mentioned there's no GPS in the early 90s, was there?
That's right. Well, so by the time I was sitting on the board, SatNav was widely available in a very precise form known as DGPS, where the signal would be monitored at essentially at an ordnance survey pillar. You would put a receiver there, and it would inform people using the precise system of the inaccuracies that were there. So you were getting really an extraordinarily precise system. And also, as I reached retirement, another transformational bit of equipment was coming in. I think back to the lead line. Now they had something called a multi-beam echo sounder. These are echo sounders which send a swathe of pulses out and enable you to get a picture of an enormous area of the seabed at one go. When I started out there as a hydrographic surveyor, things were much closer to in the days we've been talking about back in the Napoleonic Wars. We, for example, would set up that control ashore. We'd land with our theodolites, fix positions. We'd stick up big bamboo poles with huge flags on them, 16 feet by 4 feet, visible for miles and miles and miles. And we'd use that network of flags to fix our position by horizontal sextant angles, measuring two simultaneous angles, and using a lovely instrument called the station pointer. It's illustrated in the book, to plot the position. And you had to work fast. You'd be taking a position and plotting it, certainly at intervals of 2 minutes, sometimes more, laying down the pattern of soundings. We haven't talked about tides. Not much of a problem in the Mediterranean, but very significant elsewhere. Really need to have a knowledge of tides. We'd make observations so that we could reduce the soundings we took to an appropriate level, usually what we call the lowest the lowest level, an appropriate lowest level to which the tides would fall, so that people looking at the chart knew that that's the least water you're going to find, and you can add something onto it. But as time went by, we began to get more equipment, electronic equipment, which gave us pulses of sound, which were used as ranges. Even so, we had to run little checks on those, much in the same way that our predecessors had done, to work out the cuts of the angles. So I do marvel today. I just think people don't quite, as they walk about, as I say, with expecting to know precisely where they are out in the nearest centimetre, they don't really quite understand what was done for them in the past to achieve the maps and charts that they depend on.
Amazing. Okay, one question that had occurred to me as well is, if I can think of the most recent, really sort of old style Royal Navy engagement where we're talking proper war, that takes us back to 1982 in the Falklands. And how important because my sense is around that part of the world, particularly with the weather and looking at the terrain and the seas around it, that does not look particularly easy to sail around, even in 1982. So, I mean, how was the hydrography effective or helpful in that campaign?
As it happens, I had served in HMS Endurance, the Falkland Islands Guard ship, in the late 1970s, and made surveys around the Falkland Islands, Chisel Sound, Port Howard, Fox Bay, places that people have heard about nowadays that were totally unknown then. Nobody was.
So you were doing this for the first time, Michael?
Those areas, some of them for the first time, yes. But what is forgotten, in part because of that's a very unfortunate falling out, which I'll come to in a moment, was that work like that had been going on since World War II. In World War II, there was an operation called Operation Tabaran, where a British party was put into Antarctica and remained in place there. And while they were down there, they made surveys. And in all, if I remember correctly, but about 3 southern seasons, southern summers between then and 1982, there had been people like me down there making surveys around the Falkland Islands, South Georgia, down into Antarctica. But of course, there wasn't a huge demand for charts of the area. And the Ministry of Defence wasn't interested. The surveys I was doing, for example, were largely for the early days of shipborne tourism, the Lindblad Explorer, what were the safe routes that they could follow through the islands. There was one far-sighted man who understood how important things were. His name was Ewan South of Italia. He was a Royal Marines major who was sent down there. I remember picking him up in Endurance. I was navigating the ship on that occasion in Argentina, and taking him and his replacement group of Royal Marines down to the Falkland Islands. We had a most interesting chat. He was the only man I came across who had a real grasp that things could happen down here. He was a great yachtsman. He sailed around the islands, gathered a lot of information, building actually on the 19th century surveys that had been made there by my predecessors. Sadly, when he got back to Britain and went along to the Hydrographic Office, he was given a very foolish reception. He was told, "We've got no interest in your work, go away." Now, when things blew up in 1982, he got himself on board the flagship, went down with them, was highly respected, and gave them a lot of excellent advice. He really showed them the importance of hydrography. He had his own work that he'd done. But sadly, as a result, particularly in what he's written subsequently, the Hydrographic Office is given a pretty poor press, despite the fact that they had all this information available. As it happens, my own ship was in refit at that time, so I was appointed to fleet headquarters and was able to point to what was available and press the button. And soon the fleet was issued with a great set of improved charts, building on this historic database. And certainly that was of enormous help in those complex waters in the period immediately after hostilities. During that period, the ship I was serving in, I was second in command. We went back down to the Falkland Islands. We surveyed Mare Harbour to enable access to put the new airfield in. We went up to the northwest of the Falkland Islands, where it was necessary to position air pickets, air defence pickets, but which water was safe for them. So we did that, and out around South Georgia and other areas. So 1982 saw frontline pathfinding again. Yeah.
Fascinating. I've got to ask, what's it like down there with the weather?
Strong winds. The Falkland Islands themselves probably very similar to our Outer Hebrides in climate and exposure to weather. Certainly some wild weather as you cross over to South Georgia. You cross the convergence there. You really notice it. 1 minute you're in comparatively mild weather, and then you're in the southern ocean sphere. And certainly surveying around South Georgia was immensely challenging, but immensely rewarding. True pathfinding.
I bet. Wow, incredible. So 200 years later, and it's still, the ship's made of metal, but the hydrography is still as important as ever.
Mm. Mm.
Michael, this has been absolutely fascinating. It really is. The more and more you learn about this stuff, it just draws you in. It really does. But this has been so enjoyable. Thank you very much for joining me.
Not at all. It's been a great pleasure once again, Oliver. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes. Please share with friends and family. And if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.